The walls that laughed at empires. The morning mist clung to the Theodosian walls like a shroud on April 6, 1453, as 21-year-old Sultan Mehmed II stood before the greatest fortress the world had ever known. Behind him, an army of 80,000 men waited in restless anticipation. Before him, triple-layered walls rose like stone mountains, their foundations kissed by centuries of failed sieges. Constantinople, the queen of cities, the impregnable jewel that had stood unconquered for over 1,000 years. Mehmed's advisors whispered their doubts. 23 armies had broken themselves against these walls. The Avars had tried. The Arabs had tried 7 times. The Bulgars, the Rus, even the Crusaders from within had all failed to claim this prize permanently. The walls had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, standing defiant through plague, earthquake, and the grinding wheel of time itself. What made this young sultan think he could succeed where legends had failed? But Mehmed was not like the others. While they had looked up at the walls with despair, he looked down at the ground with possibility. The Byzantine defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XI, numbered barely 8,000 souls. Yet they stood confident, almost amused. The Italian engineer Giovanni Giustiniani had arrived with 700 men and expertise in defensive warfare. The Byzantine generals examined Mehmed's massive bronze cannons with professional interest, but little fear. Cannons had been tried before. The walls had endured. They always endured. The outer wall stood 20 feet thick at its base. Behind it, a second wall rose even higher, and behind that, the final inner wall towered 60 feet, studded with 96 towers that had watched civilizations crumble. For weeks, Mehmed's great bombards roared, their massive stone balls crashing against the ancient masonry. The basilica cannon, a monster 27 feet long that required 200 men and 60 oxen to position, fired 7 times a day. Each shot shook the earth like thunder from an angry god. The walls shuddered, stones fell, gaps appeared. And yet, night after night, the Byzantines repaired the damage. They worked by torchlight, singing hymns as they filled the breaches with earth and timber, stones and prayers. By morning, the walls stood again, as if mocking the Ottoman artillery. With the cannons destroyed by day, faith rebuilt by night. Mehmed's officers began to calculate. At this rate, the siege would drain the treasury before it drained Byzantine resolve. The Sultan walked the camp alone that night, his mind churning like a storm at sea. He had studied this city obsessively since childhood. He knew its history better than most who lived within its walls. He knew that in 1204, the Fourth Crusade had breached these defenses not through military might, but through unexpected infiltration. He knew that the Golden Horn, the city's natural harbor, was sealed by a massive chain preventing naval assault. He knew every tower, every gate, every supposed weakness that wasn't actually weak at all. But there was something the defenders might not have considered, something beneath their notice, literally beneath. The Sultan summoned his Serbian miners in the dead of night. These men knew earth and stone as sailors knew wind and tide. They had excavated silver from mountain veins and coal from the belly of the world. They understood how ground could betray even the strongest structure. The Sultan's instructions were simple, but the execution would be anything but. Tunnel under the walls. Not to create a breach for the army, the walls were too thick, the distance too great. No, the goal was subtler and far more devastating. Undermine the foundations. Let the wall's own massive weight become their executioner. The work began in absolute secrecy. While the cannons continued their thunderous assault by day, drawing all eyes and ears upward, beneath the earth a different war commenced. The miners dug from Ottoman-controlled buildings near the walls, working in shifts around the clock. They excavated narrow passages barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, shoring them up with timber as they went. The soil was clay and rock, difficult work, but it held its shape better than sand would have. Every shovelful of earth was removed in silence, carried away in sacks to be scattered far from the tunnel entrances. The technique was ancient but refined through centuries of siege warfare. The tunnel would extend under the enemy fortification, then create a chamber directly beneath the wall's foundation. This chamber would be packed with combustible materials, sulfur, pitch, and dried wood. When ignited, the intense heat would crack the stone foundation while the timber supports burned away. The ground would collapse and the wall above would follow, sinking into the void like a ship into the sea. But Constantinople was not defended by fools. On the fifth day of the underground assault, a Byzantine engineer named John Grant noticed something strange. A native of Scotland who had traveled east to sell his expertise possessed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the language of stone and earth. During his morning inspection of the inner fortifications, he placed his hand against the wall and felt it, a vibration so faint it might have been imagination. But Grant had spent 30 years listening to what structures wanted to say. This wall was trembling, not from cannon fire, from below. Grant ordered bronze shields placed against the walls at ground level. Then he waited, visiting each shield several times daily, pressing his ear against the metal. Bronze, he knew, transmitted subterranean sounds better than stone. For 3 days he heard nothing but the ordinary settling of ancient masonry. On the 4th day, the shield near the gate of Carassius hummed with a rhythm that matched no natural phenomenon. Digging. They were digging. They were digging. The Scottish engineer burst into Emperor Constantine's chamber without ceremony. "They're under us," he announced. "The Turks have gone beneath the walls." Constantine, who had ruled for only 4 years but aged a lifetime in them, felt ice flood his veins. A breach in the walls could be repaired, a gate could be reinforced, but an enemy beneath your feet, invisible and untouchable, could bring down everything without warning. "Are you certain?" "As certain as gravity," Grant replied, "and I know where they're digging. I can hear them." What followed was a siege within a siege, an invisible battle fought in absolute darkness beneath the oblivious feet of armies. Grant assembled his own team of miners, Greeks, Italians, and a handful of German mercenaries who understood underground warfare. They began their own tunnels, not to undermine the walls, but to intercept the Ottoman excavations. It was the most dangerous cat-and-mouse game in the world, played in spaces where a man could barely turn around, where bad air could suffocate you without warning, where enemy and ally could only be distinguished by the split second before knives found throats. The Byzantine counterminers worked by sound and intuition. They would dig in the direction to the enemy excavation, listening constantly for the telltale scrape of tools on stone. When they judged themselves close enough, they would break through into the Ottoman tunnel. What happened next was warfare stripped to its most primal form. In passages lit only by flickering lamps, men fought with knives and picks in the suffocating dark. There was no room for swords, no space for nobility. Only the quick and the lucky survived. The Ottomans, discovering their tunnels compromised, tried to set their charges early. Byzantine miners would smell the sulfur and know they had minutes, perhaps only seconds, to flood the tunnel with water or collapse it before the fire could spread. 3 times Grant's men broke into Ottoman excavations just as the fires were being lit. Twice they succeeded in extinguishing them. Once the tunnel exploded anyway, killing 12 men on both sides and creating a crater that appeared mysteriously inside the Byzantine outer wall, startling soldiers who had no idea death lurked beneath their feet.
Above ground, Mehmed's visible siege continued. The cannons roared, naval assaults were launched against the seawalls, false attacks were staged at the Gate of Rhegium to draw defenders from other sections. But in his command tent, the Sultan paced restlessly, receiving hourly reports from his underground war. Tunnel 7 had been discovered and destroyed. Tunnel 12 had broken through but was flooded before charges could be set. Tunnel 4 had collapsed, burying 17 men. The Byzantines had proven themselves as resourceful below as above. But Mehmed had learned patience from his failures. At 19, he had been sultan before, only to be forced from the throne by his own father's manipulation. He had studied that humiliation, dissected it, let it teach him that direct assault was not the only path to victory. Sometimes you win by making the enemy fight on multiple fronts until their resources stretched too thin. Sometimes you win by making them believe they're winning. So he kept the tunnels coming. For every one the Byzantines discovered, 2 more were begun. Grant's team couldn't be everywhere. They had to prioritize, to gamble on which sounds indicated genuine threats and which were decoys. The Ottoman miners began playing tricks, digging loudly in one location while advancing silently in another. They would start tunnels, then deliberately allow them to be discovered, training the Byzantines to expect attacks from certain angles while the real excavations proceeded elsewhere. The psychological toll was devastating. Byzantine soldiers on the walls at least could see their enemy, could measure the distance between threat and defense. But the men sleeping in barracks now lay awake at night, wondering if the earth beneath them was being hollowed out, if they would wake to find themselves plummeting into darkness. Every unexplained sound became a potential tunnel. Every settling stone sparked panic. Grant himself was approaching exhaustion. He slept in 2-hour increments, always with his hand pressed against stone or metal, his subconscious mind listening even in dreams. His fingers had become so sensitized to vibration that the ordinary rumble of cartwheels made him dizzy. He began to hear digging everywhere, in every shadow and corner, until his own men worried their engineer was losing his mind. On May 16th, 40 days into the siege, Mehmed's miners completed Tunnel 19. It had taken a circuitous route, starting far from the walls and curving underground in a path that avoided the sectors where Byzantine countermining had been most successful. The excavation extended 127 feet underground, nearly twice the depth of previous attempts. The chamber beneath the wall's foundation was larger than any before, a cavity 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, 8 feet high. It had taken 3 weeks to dig, every foot a gamble that they wouldn't be discovered, that the earth wouldn't collapse, that the air wouldn't run out. Now it was packed with combustibles, barrels of sulfur, dried wood that would burn hot and fast, pitch that would turn the chamber into an oven. The Ottoman miners inserted long fuses made of linen soaked in saltpeter and oil, trails of fire that would give them time to evacuate before the world ended. They said prayers to Allah, crossed themselves, some of the miners were Serbian Christians, and touched the earth in farewell. They had lived in darkness for weeks. They deserved to die in sunlight. The fire was lit just before dawn. The fuses hissed and sparked, racing down the tunnel like burning snakes. The miners scrambled back through passages they could navigate by touch alone, their lamps extinguished to prevent premature ignition of the volatile air. Behind them, the fire reached the chamber and kissed the sulfur. What happened next, the Byzantines would later describe as the earth vomiting in rage. The explosion didn't make a sound, it made the sound, a roar so deep and profound it seemed to come from the planet's core. The ground convulsed. The walls didn't just crack, they liquefied, massive stones that had stood for a millennium turning to dust and rubble in an instant. A section of the outer wall 60 feet long simply vanished into a crater that glowed with residual heat. Soldiers on both sides were thrown to the ground. Birds fell from the sky, stunned by the concussive wave. For a moment, both armies stood in shock. Then the Ottoman war drums began, and 80,000 men surged forward with a roar that rivaled the explosion itself. The breach was open. The impossible had happened. The walls that laughed at empires were broken. But this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the end, and the Byzantines had one more lesson to teach. Even as Ottoman shock troops rushed towards the breach, Constantine's defenders were already moving. They had planned for this. Grant had warned that eventually one tunnel would succeed, so they had prepared a fallback defense, a semicircular barricade of earth and timber behind the outer wall, positioned precisely where a major breach would likely occur. The Ottoman vanguard hit this secondary defense and staggered. Crossbow bolts and arrows fell like deadly rain. Greek fire, that ancient Byzantine secret weapon, poured from above, turning men into screaming torches. The breach that should have been highway into the city became a killing ground. For 6 hours, Mehmed's forces tried to exploit the gap. For 6 hours, they were repelled by defenders who fought with the desperation of men protecting not just a city, but the last fragment of an empire that had ruled the world. As sunset approached on May 16th, Mehmed withdrew his forces from the breach. The attack had failed. The walls, even broken walls, still held. In his tent, his generals argued for retreat. They had tried everything: the cannons, the naval assault, the mines. The city was bleeding them dry. It was time to admit defeat, like the 23 armies before them. But Mehmed had learned something from the day's battle. The Byzantine defense, though ferocious, was thin. Grant's countermanding had prevented a decisive breakthrough, yes, but it had also exhausted the defenders. Every soldier fighting at the breach was a soldier pulled from another section. Every resource spent repairing walls was a resource not spent on food or morale. The Byzantines were winning each battle, but losing the war of attrition. The Sultan ordered his miners back underground. Not to create another dramatic explosion. The Byzantines would be expecting that now. Instead, he wanted them to do something more insidious. Create instability. Honeycomb the ground beneath multiple sections of wall. Make the defenders paranoid, unable to trust the earth beneath any fortification. Force Grant and his team to spread themselves impossibly thin, listening to everything, sleeping nowhere, trusting nothing. Over the next 12 days, Ottoman miners started 43 different excavations. Most were shallow, intended only to create sounds that would drive the counterminers to exhaustion. But 7 were real, deep tunnels probing for weak points in the foundation network. Grant's team discovered and destroyed 4 of them. 2 were abandoned when bad air made them untenable. But the 7th reached its target. On the night of May 28th, the last full night of Byzantine Constantinople, that last tunnel achieved something remarkable. Not an explosion, but a carefully controlled collapse. The miners removed the support timbers one by one, then flooded the tunnel with water. The sudden saturation turned the clay soil to liquid. Slowly, like a body settling into death, a 40-foot section of the inner wall began to sink. Not dramatically, not with thunder and fire, just a slow, inevitable descent into the void. By morning, the wall in that section stood 3 feet lower than before. It didn't look like much, still formidable, still defendable, but it changed the mathematics of the assault. Scaling ladders that had been too short were now viable. Soldiers who would need siege towers could now climb the wall with determination and luck. Constantine XI himself walked the affected section as the sun rose on May 29th. He was 48 years old, the last emperor of an empire that had endured since the birth of Christ. He knew what that 3-foot difference meant. He knew today the walls would finally fall. But he also knew something that Mehmed, for all his brilliance, might not have fully understood. The walls were never the true defense of Constantinople. Yes, they were magnificent. Yes, they had turned back armies. But the real fortress had always been the spirit of the people who manned them. Citizens who became soldiers, merchants who became warriors, intellectuals who became heroes. The walls were merely the physical manifestation of human refusal to surrender.
Constantine gathered his remaining defenders, fewer than 5,000 now. He told them what they already knew. Today would be the last day. He didn't promise victory. He didn't guarantee survival. He simply asked them to make their stand worthy of their ancestors, to fight so that future generations would know that Constantinople did not fall easily, did not fall quietly, did not fall without making the earth itself tremble with the fury of its resistance. The final Ottoman assault began at dawn and continued for 12 hours. They came in waves, irregular troops first to exhaust the defenders, then the Anatolian regulars, finally the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite guards, the finest infantry in the world. They came at the sunken section of wall. They came at the breach created days earlier. They came at the gates and the sea walls and every point where Ottoman ingenuity had weakened Byzantine stone. And still, impossibly, the defenders held. Grant himself led a contingent of engineers who dropped burning oil on attackers trying to plant explosives. Constantine fought in the thick of battle, his imperial regalia abandoned for soldiers' armor, indistinguishable from the common men dying beside him. Every inch of wall was contested. Every tower became a monument to human courage. But courage, no matter how pure, cannot indefinitely defy mathematics. The Ottomans had 50 men for every defender. They had cannons and tunnels and the accumulated frustration of 53 days of siege. When a small gate near the sunken section was found partially open, whether by treachery, error, or Ottoman sabotage remains debated to this day, a group of janissaries pushed through before it could be closed. The flood, once started, could not be stopped. Ottoman forces poured through the gate, climbing the lowered wall section, overwhelming the exhausted defenders. Constantine XI died fighting in the streets, his body never positively identified among the thousands of dead. Grant survived but was captured, later serving the Ottomans as an engineer. The Byzantine Empire, which had endured for 1,123 years, ended on May 29, 1453. But here is what the history books often miss. The siege that should have lasted weeks lasted nearly 2 months because of those tunnels and counter-tunnels. The city that should have fallen to Mehmed's massive cannons alone held firm until underground warfare finally tipped the balance. The Byzantines, even in defeat, taught the world that defense is not just about building higher walls, but about thinking three-dimensionally, fighting on every level, refusing to accept that any position is truly impregnable or any situation truly hopeless. Mehmed II, later called Mehmed the Conqueror, learned lessons that day too. He learned that siege warfare was evolving beyond simple bombardment. He learned that the earth beneath could be as valuable as the sky above. He learned that victory often goes not to the strongest, but to the most creative, the most persistent, the most willing to attack problems from unexpected angles. The Ottoman Empire would go on to become one of history's greatest civilizations, ruling for nearly 5 more centuries. But Mehmed never forgot what it took to breach those walls. In later sieges, he always deployed miners alongside his cannons. He invested in counter-mining training for his engineers. He understood that the future of warfare was not just about what you could destroy, but about what you could undermine. And the walls themselves? Most still stand today in modern Istanbul, monuments to both Byzantine engineering and Ottoman determination. The sections that were mined and collapsed have been rebuilt, restored, preserved. Tourists walk along them unaware that beneath their feet, narrow tunnels still exist in some places, silent testimony to the invisible war that decided an empire's fate. The lesson echoes across centuries. When the frontal assault fails, when the direct path is blocked, when the walls seem too high to climb, look down. Look for the foundation. Question your assumptions. Attack the problem from an angle no one expects. The most impregnable fortress still rests on ground that can be shifted. The strongest position still has a weakness, if you're willing to work in darkness and patience to find it. Mehmed II understood this at 21. He didn't have the strongest army or the best cannons. What he had was the willingness to dig deeper, literally and figuratively, than anyone else. To commit to victory not just with the obvious tools of war, but with ingenuity, with perseverance, with the understanding that obstacles are only permanent if you accept them as such. The walls of Constantinople fell, not because they were weak, but because someone refused to accept that they couldn't be beaten. They fell because underground, in darkness, anonymous miners fought and died for every inch of earth. They fell because one young sultan looked at an impossible challenge and thought, not how do I climb over this, but what holds this up? That question, what holds this up, might be the most powerful tool in history. Every empire, every fortune, every seemingly permanent fixture of the world rests on foundations. Find those foundations, understand them, and the impossible becomes merely difficult. The difficult becomes achievable. And the walls that laughed at empires crumble into dust, teaching future generations that nothing is truly impregnable, nothing lasts forever, and the greatest victories often happen when no one is looking.
In the darkness beneath the earth, where history is written in sweat and sulfur, where glory and death arrive without witnesses, that's where empires change hands. That's where the future is excavated from the past. That's where a 21-year-old sultan taught the world that sometimes, to reach the heavens, you must first descend into the earth.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.